The Doctrine of Biblical Predestination and Free Will, Ante-Nicene Church. Father's Perspective. Part 2, Historical Theology, the Ante-Nicene Perspective. Chapter 5-3, Predestination in Ante-Nicene Writings. Expository Analysis, Interpretation of Romans 9 by Early Fathers. Romans 9, Paul's discourse on God's sovereign election, posed a significant interpretive challenge for the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers as they navigated the tension between predestination and free will. Unlike later theologians like Augustine, who emphasized double predestination and exhaustive divine control, the Fathers, Clement of Rome, Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian, approached this chapter with a theology shaped by apostolic tradition, Jewish covenantalism, and resistance to Gnostic determinism. Their expository analysis focused on God's purposeful sovereignty in salvation history, harmonizing it with human agency, rather than endorsing a deterministic fate for individuals. Context and focus: Romans 9 verses 11-18, discussing Jacob and Esau, the older will serve the younger, not because of works but because of him who calls, and Pharaoh, I have raised you up. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy. Highlights God's prerogative. The Fathers saw this as evidence of divine sovereignty, but not in isolation. Irenaeus, in Against Heresies 4.21.2, interprets this as God's foreknowledge, prognosis, directing history. God, foreknowing all things, arranged the hardening of Pharaoh for the manifestation of his power. He ties it to Exodus 9 verse 16, where Pharaoh's resistance serves Israel's deliverance, suggesting predestination as God's plan for redemption, not individual damnation. This aligns with Romans 11 verse 32, that he may have mercy on all, emphasizing a salvific purpose. Human agency. Justin Martyr, in First Apology 43, addresses Romans 9 verse 19, why does he still find fault, arguing, God does not compel, each one's works are his own. He likely saw Pharaoh's initial self-hardening, Exodus 8 verse 15, as evidence of free will, with God's action, 9:12, reinforcing, not initiating, resistance, a judicial act, not double predestination. Tertullian, in Against Marcion 2.23, concurs. God's prescience does not destroy liberty, interpreting election as God's choice of means, e.g., Israel, not exhaustive control. Corporate scope: Clement of Rome's 1 Clement 29:1, let us consider the noble examples of the elect, reflects a collective view, possibly seeing Jacob's election as Israel's calling, Romans 9 verses 4-5, not individual fates. The Fathers avoided Augustine's later focus on personal reprobation, Enchiridion ch. 98, framing Romans 9 as God's covenantal sovereignty, balanced by calls to faith, Romans 10:9. Antideterministic lens, against Gnostic fatalism, Irenaeus, Against Heresies 4.37.1, insists humans remain free, interpreting Romans 9 as God's wise governance, not coercion. Their exegesis thus limited predestination to redemption's framework, preserving agency. Irenaeus, Against Heresies 4.21.2. Pharaoh, too, hardened his own heart, as we have said, and resisted God, but God, foreknowing all things, arranged the hardening of Pharaoh for the manifestation of his power, and for the benefit of mankind, that they might know that he is the Lord of all. Irenaeus' interpretation of Romans 9 verses 17-18, I have raised you up, he hardens whomever he wills, in Against Heresies 4.21.2 emphasizes God's sovereignty as purposeful, not arbitrary. By noting Pharaoh's self-hardening, hardened his own heart, he aligns with Exodus 8 verse 15, where Pharaoh acts freely before God's intervention, Exodus 9 verse 12. The phrase, foreknowing all things, prognosis, cf. Romans 8 verse 29, underscores divine omniscience, arranging, disposut, events like the plagues to display power, manifestation of his power, for Israel's deliverance. Exodus 9 verse 16. This benefits mankind, suggesting a redemptive intent, not double predestination. For Irenaeus, God's hardening is a judicial response to Pharaoh's choice, not an eternal decree of damnation, contrasting Augustine's view. Enchiridion ch 98, that God predestines reprobation. The broader context of Romans 11 verse 32, that he may have mercy on all, supports this, framing sovereignty as salvation-oriented. Irenaeus' anti-Gnostic stance, against heresies. 1.6.2, rejects fixed fates, insisting humans retain agency. 4.37.1, God made man free, so Pharaoh's role serves God's plan without negating his will. This limits predestination to historical purpose, God's glory and humanity's good, not exhaustive control or dual decrees. The Ante-Nicene lens, shaped by Jewish covenantalism, Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, sees election as a means, not an end, harmonizing Romans 9 with calls to faith, Romans 10 verse 9. Irenaeus thus interprets Paul's mercy, on whom I have mercy, as God's wise governance, not coercion, aligning with their pre-Augustinian theology of synergy. Justin Martyr, First Apology 43. We have learned from the prophets, and we hold it to be true, that punishments, and chastisements, and good rewards, are rendered according to the merit of each man's actions. Unless the human race have the power of avoiding evil and choosing good by free choice, they are not accountable for their actions. God does not compel, since he desires that each should be saved by his own choice. Justin's First Apology 43 directly engages Romans 9 verse 19, why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? By asserting human accountability, countering any deterministic reading. His appeal to prophets, e.g., Ezekiel 33 verse 11, turn, and live, and belief that punishments are rendered according to actions, reflect a theology where God's sovereignty, he hardens whomever he wills, Romans 9:18, does not negate free will. The phrase, power of avoiding evil and choosing good echoes proeresis, a Greco-Roman concept Justin adapts to affirm agency. Opposing Stoic fate and Gnostic necessity, against heresies 1.6.1. God does not compel, directly challenges the idea of double predestination, unlike Calvin's Institutes 3.23, where God decrees damnation, insisting salvation hinges on his own choice, cf. John 3 verse 16. For Justin, Pharaoh's hardening or Esau's rejection, Romans 9 verse 13, results from their actions, with God's will using, not causing, their resistance, as with Judas, John 17 verse 12. This aligns with Romans 10:9's call to faith, limiting predestination to God's redemptive plan, Ephesians 1 verse 5, not dual fates. Justin's apologetic context, defending Christianity to Romans, shapes this balance, ensuring God's justice, Romans 2 verse 6, rests on human response, not preordained reprobation. The Father's pre-Augustinian view thus sees Romans 9 as God's sovereign means, election of Israel, harmonized with free will, rejecting exhaustive control or eternal damnation decrees. Tertullian, against Marcion 2.23. God's prescience does not destroy liberty. Man's will is free, and therefore he is subject to judgment, for if his will were not free, he could not be held accountable. God foreknows all things, yet he does not compel. Tertullian's against Mark Ion 2.23 interprets Romans 9 verses 18 to 19, he has mercy. He hardens, who can resist his will? Through a lens preserving human liberty. Against Martian's dualism and Gnostic determinism. God's prescience does not destroy liberty directly addresses Paul's question, asserting that foreknowledge. Prognosis, as in, whom he foreknew, Romans 8 verse 29, predicts, not dictates. Outcomes. Man's will is free, aligns with autoexousios, self-determination. Echoing Irenaeus, 4.37.1, and counters exhaustive determinism, where every act is preordained, cf. Calvin, Institutes 2.2. Tertullian ties accountability to freedom. Subject to judgment, reflecting Romans 2 verse 6, render to each according to his works, so Pharaoh's hardening, 9:17, or Esau's fate, 9:13, stems from there. Choices, not dual predestination. God foreknows, yet he does not compel, rejects. Augustine's irresistible grace, on grace and free will 41, seeing God's will as sovereign yet non-coercive, using human acts, e.g., Pharaoh's defiance, Exodus 8:15, for purpose, Romans 9 verse 17, to show my power. Tertullian's Roman legal. Context sharpens this, justice requires agency, not fate, limiting predestination to salvation's framework, 1 Timothy 2 verse 4. The Father's expository lens, resisting Gnostic fixed natures, against heresies 1.6.1, interprets Romans 9 as God's plan. Unfolding through free wills, not decreeing eternal damnation, aligning with their pre-Augustinian theology. Clement of Rome, 1 Clement 29:1. Let us consider, beloved, how the Lord continually proves to us that there will be a future resurrection. Let us consider the noble examples of the elect, how they were obedient to the will of God. Clement's 1 Clement 29:1 indirectly engages Romans 9 verse 11, not because of works, but because of him who calls, by focusing on the elect, eklektoi, suggesting God's sovereign choice, as with Jacob, 9:13. The Lord continually proves, a future resurrection, ties election to a redemptive end, Romans 11 verse 26, not reprobation, contrasting Augustine's dual decree, Enchiridion ch 100. Noble examples of the elect, and, obedient to the will of God, imply agency, election. Calls for response, as with, obedience to Jesus Christ, 1 Peter 1 verse 2, not deterministic. Fate. Clement's pastoral context, restoring Corinthian unity, frames sovereignty as God's, almighty will, 27:5, yet, obedient, hypokui, reflects choice, not compulsion, aligning with Romans 10:9's faith. Unlike Calvin's exhaustive control, Institutes 3.23, Clement avoids micromanaging human acts, seeing predestination as God's plan for life, Ezekiel 33 verse 11, not death. Against Gnostic fatalism, against heresies 1.6.2, he upholds moral responsibility, elect status requires obedience. Limiting predestination to a corporate, salvific scope, Israel, the Church, not individual damnation. This pre-Augustinian view harmonizes Romans 9 with human agency, rejecting double predestination or exhaustive determinism. Ephesians 1 verse 11. In him we have obtained an inheritance, having been predestined according to the purpose of him who works all things according to the counsel of his will. Ephesians 1 verse 11, with its mention of being predestined, prooristans, could have been a key text for the Ante-Nicene Fathers interpreting Romans 9's emphasis on divine sovereignty. I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, 9:18. The phrase, according to the purpose, kata prothesin, and counsel of his will, Bullen 2. Thelemetos autou, aligns with Paul's argument about God's sovereign choice, 9:11. Because of him who calls, suggesting a deliberate divine plan. For Irenaeus, this could reinforce his view in Against Heresies 4.21.2 that God arranged the hardening of Pharaoh for the manifestation of his power, seeing predestination as God's purposeful ordering of salvation through Christ, in him, and auto, not a dual decree of salvation and damnation. The Fathers, like Justin Martyr, first. Apology 43, might emphasize, we have obtained an inheritance as a corporate blessing for the Church, not individual faiths, limiting its scope to redemption, cf. Ephesians 1 verse 5, not reprobation. The broad phrase, works all things, could suggest exhaustive determinism, but Clement of Rome, 1 Clement 27:5-6, by his Almighty will he establish the heavens, might interpret it as God's governance of creation's ultimate end, resurrection, 29:1, not every human act. Against Gnostic fatalism, Against Heresies 1.6.1, Tertullian, Against Marcion 2.23, God's prescience does not destroy liberty, could argue this purpose enables free response. Romans 10 verse 9, not coercion. The Ante-Nicene lens, shaped by Jewish covenantalism, Deuteronomy 7 verse 6, would see Romans 9's election paralleled here. As God's plan for a people, harmonized with agency, whoever believes, John 3:16, thus avoiding Augustine's later double predestination, Enchiridion ch 100. Their exegesis balances sovereignty with moral responsibility, focusing on God's redemptive intent. Acts 4 verses 27-28. For truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your plan had predestined to take place. Acts 4 verses 27-28, from the early church's prayer, directly uses predestined. Proorison, offering a lens for the Ante-Nicene Fathers to interpret Romans 9's sovereignty, I have raised you up, 9:17. The text attributes Jesus' crucifixion to God's hand and plan, aligning with Paul's emphasis on divine will, 9:18, he hardens whomever he wills. Irenaeus might see this as akin to Against Heresies 4.21.2, arranged, for the manifestation of his power, where God's predestination uses human actions, Pharaoh, Herod, Pilate, for redemption, not eternal damnation. The corporate scope, Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, parallels Romans 9:4-5's focus on Israel's role, suggesting a plan for salvation. History, not individual determinism. Justin Martyr, First Apology 43, God does not compel, could argue that Herod and Pilate's choices, though evil, serve God's purpose, cf. Genesis 50 verse 20, preserving agency, human will aligns with, not succumbs to, divine intent. Tertullian's Against Marcion 2.23, man's will is free, might interpret, to do whatever your hand, predestined, as God. Foreknowing and directing outcomes, not scripting every act, limiting predestination. To Christ's death, 1 Timothy 2 verse 6. Clement, 1 Clement 29:1, could link this to resurrection, seeing sovereignty as redemptive, not coercive. Against Gnostic fixed natures, Against Heresies 1.6.1, the Fathers would reject exhaustive control. Framing Romans 9's hardening as a means, Exodus 9 verse 16, not an end, harmonizing it with human response, Acts 17 verse 30. This pre-Augustinian exegesis avoids double predestination, institutes 3.23, focusing on God's salvific plan through free agents. Not dual decrees. 2 Timothy 1 verse 9. Who saved us and called us to a holy calling, not because of our works but because of his own purpose and grace, which he gave us in Christ Jesus before the ages began. 2 Timothy 1 verse 9, with its emphasis on God's purpose and grace, prophesin kai. Cheiron, before the ages began, pro chronon Ionian, complements Romans 9:11, not because of works but because of him who calls, offering the Ante-Nicene Fathers a text to explore divine sovereignty. Irenaeus might connect this to Against Heresies 4.21.2, foreknowing all things, arranged, for the benefit of mankind, seeing predestination as God's eternal plan in Christ, not human merit. Aligning with Romans 9's election of Jacob, 9:13. The phrase, saved us and called us, suggests a sovereign act, isosin kai ecclesian, yet, holy calling, klesin hagia. Implies a response, as Justin Martyr's first Apology 43, saved by his own choice, might argue, harmonizing with Romans 10:9's faith. Tertullian, against Mark Ion 2.23, God foreknows, yet he does not compel, could see, before the ages, as God's foreknowledge, prognosis, not exhaustive determinism, limiting predestination to salvation's means, 1 Timothy 2 verse 4, not every act. Clements 1. Clement 29:1, obedient to the will of God, might frame this calling as a purpose for the elect, church, not dual fates, contrasting Augustine's reprobation. Enchiridion ch 98. Against Gnostic fatalism, against heresies 1.6.1, the Fathers would reject fixed destinies, insisting agency remains, God's grace invites, not forces, belief, John 3 verse 16. Their exegesis of Romans 9's mercy, 9:18, would see this as God's redemptive initiative, not a decree of damnation, preserving moral responsibility in a pre-Augustinian theology of synergy.